Hey guys, good morning. Happy Tuesday. And today we are going to be talking about rereading. So, we focused on rereading last week, and since it's such an important skill to practice, we're going to work on it again today. So, you're looking at your goal, and your goal again this week is going to be to reread a text to increase understanding. Now, last week we talked about what it means to reread something, and that just means you read a passage again to make sure you completely understand it. And this is such a great comprehension strategy. It'll really ensure that you're understanding the passage, and if there's questions being asked, you'll definitely be able to get the answers correct if you've reread the passage. Now, don't forget the hint that we talked about last week when it comes to rereading. If you're asked a question about a passage, you're going to reread it to make sure you have the correct answer. Now, this is super important, especially when you're going over a test or something, maybe when you're taking a test. If you're unsure of a question, you definitely want to go back, reread, and prove your answer. Okay, so let's get to the story that we're going to be rereading this week. So we'll take a look at the read first. And then once we get to our examples of rereading, then we'll go back and we'll reread the text again to make sure we have the correct answer. So let me pull up the story for you. All right, so our story this week is called Freedom at Fort Moose. Now, don't forget, our essential question is, why is it important to keep a record of the past? And yesterday, we talked a little bit about records from the past. Those could be photographs, letters, and even diary entries. Those types of things, they are records of the past. They tell us what happened before. So let's get into our story. And don't forget, we will be rereading the text to make sure we understand it.
By September of 1754, 12-year-old Lucius Jackson and his family had been living at Fort Mose in St. Augustine, Florida, for a year. They were part of a group who had escaped from a plantation in South Carolina. They had heard that Fort Mose was a place of refuge for runaways. Over the years, many people were willing to endure the treacherous journey there in return for the promise of freedom. During his time at Fort Mose, Lucius kept a diary to record what happened there.
So here's a really great example of how a diary is going to tell us what happened during the time Lucius lived on Fort Moose. So keep that in mind, because that does have to do with our essential question. We're going to be learning straight from Lucius's diary things that happened while he was at the refuge shelter.
17th September 1754. It has been raining for more than a week now. This weather reminds me of my days learning to read and write back in Charleston. When the rains came, we couldn't work in the fields, and we were forced to stay in the cabins. We knew that Mr. Slocum, the landowner, detested getting his boots wet, so he rarely came to check on us. He thought that all we knew were work and obedience. Miss Celia took a great risk writing letters and words on the dirt floor of the cabin for us children to learn. She said that, as the eldest member in our cabin, it was a risk she was willing to take. Learning to read was easy for me because I was so happy to learn how to turn letters into words and words into ideas. I believe that reading is a gift that cannot be measured. Mr. Samuel Cantor believes this too. He is a farmer who lives near us and who gave me this fine diary. He said, "You are doing a good thing, Lucius. In years to come, people can read about this place and understand what we have risked to gain our freedom."
So we are getting a direct sneak peek into Lucius's life by reading his diary. These diary entries are going to be able to tell us how he risked his freedom, we're going to learn about the place he lived and understand how he risked to gain freedom. Let's keep going.
8th October 1754. Last night I got to go on patrol with my father. My duty involved walking along the wall of the fort with him, looking and listening for anything unusual. It has been a while since we came under attack, but we cannot let down our guard. We also listen for any people who may be coming here to seek freedom, as we did about 1 year ago. While on patrol, I thought about the night my family came to Fort Mose, and how scared but hopeful all of us felt as we entered through the big, heavy gates. I must stop writing now, as it is my turn today to help gather palm fronds, which we lay out in the sun to dry. Once they are dried, they can be used to repair older huts and to build new ones. Each week more people come to the fort. Our priest, Father de las Casas, keeps the records, and he tells us that there are almost 100 people now.
So, using his diary entry from October 8th, 1754, we're learning that he got to go on patrol with his father. We're learning that his priest kept a record of all of the new people who were coming. And we know on October 8th, 1754, there were almost 100 people at the fort when Lucius lived there. So this gives us an exact account of how Lucius lived.
October 1754. Last week a new family arrived all the way from Virginia, and like everyone else, they arrived almost starved and weak beyond belief. My mother helped the family by giving them clean clothes to replace the ones they had been wearing, and their old ones were quickly discarded. The day after they arrived, I tried to talk to the boy who was about my age, but he ignored me. The next day I tried again to speak to the boy, whose name is Will. I showed him this diary and explained that it depicts as accurately as possible our life at Fort Mose and the people who come here. He seemed surprised and asked, "You know how to read and write?" "Yes," I told him. He looked at me without speaking, but I could see a question in his eyes. "Do you want to learn?" I asked him. "Is it not dangerous?" he asked quietly, looking around to see if anyone could hear us. I smiled, remembering how long it took me to understand freedom and what it meant. "Will," I said to my new friend, "here at Fort Mose, you are free to learn, and I am free to teach you." We began our lessons right away.
All right, so we got an account again on October 26, 1754, of how life was like for Lucius on Fort Mose. Now, you learned from this page that he taught his friend how to read and write. Now, I have a specific question from the text that I want you to help me answer. But in order to answer that question, we're going to have to reread the text. So let me show you the question so that way you can help me figure out the answer to it. So our question for this week that we're going to go back to the text and reread to get the answer for is, why is Lucius Jackson at Fort Mose? So we are going to head right back to the text and we're going to look for an answer so we can figure out why he's there. Now, maybe you already know the answer and you're ready to go ahead and type it in. That's awesome and great, but I really want you to get into the habit of going back to the text, rereading it to double check your answer. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this lesson, it's very important to do that, especially if you're taking a big test. You want to make sure you have the right answer. So let's head back to the text and let's figure out why Lucius Jackson was there. All right, so for this answer, we're going to head right back to the beginning on page 397, and we're going to reread the first paragraph, and we're going to see if we can figure out why Lucius Jackson and his family were at Fort Mose. By September of 1754, 12-year-old Lucius Jackson and his family had been living at Fort Mose in St. Augustine, Florida for a year. So we know that on this day, they've been there a year. We don't know yet why they were there, so let's keep reading. They were part of a group who escaped from a plantation in South Carolina. So this sentence does require a little bit of background knowledge from a few of the weeks before. Now remember, a plantation is a place where slaves went and they did work. So he was part of a group who escaped from a plantation in South Carolina. Okay, so when slaves went to plantations, they had to work there. They usually didn't get paid enough money for the work that they did. So when you're on a plantation, you are technically a slave and you're doing work for pretty much nothing. Now, you and I know that's both not fair. So we both know it's not fair. So we know for a fact that they escaped because they wanted a better life. Let's keep going. They had heard that Fort Mose was a place of refuge for runaways. Now remember, if a place is a refuge, that means it's a shelter, it's a protection from things that are going bad. So they are at Fort Mose because they wanted a safe place to stay. Over the years, many people were willing to endure the treacherous journey there in return for the promise of freedom. During his time at Fort Mose, Lucius kept a diary to record what happened there. So there's our strategy in action. We have reread the first paragraph on page 397. Now, if you still don't understand why his family's there, I definitely encourage you to reread it one more time. Pay close attention to where they escaped from, which is a plantation in South Carolina. And remember, plantations are places where slaves were taken to work. And remember that they went to Fort Mose for refuge. Okay, so knowing those things and after rereading that passage, you and I should be able to answer our question. So let's head back to our question. Okay, so here's our question. Why is Lucius Jackson at Fort Mose? Now, remember, him and his family, they left a plantation in South Carolina. Why would anybody want to leave a plantation? Of course, because you're not being treated fair at a plantation. Remember, plantations are places where slaves went to work. They often didn't get paid. They were sometimes beat by their owners. And it was just a really, really bad place to live. So when I read that, I'm learning that he ran away. He escaped. When you escape from something, you're leaving. You're getting away from it, even if you don't have permission to leave. So I know that he's ran away, him and his family, and they were looking for a place of refuge. And remember, refuge is a safe shelter where you'll be taken care of. So why is Lucius Jackson there? Let's get started with our answer. Remember, when you start your answer, you must include a part of the question. So when I start my answer, I'm going to start with Lucius Jackson. Oh, let's spell Jackson right, Miss Valadez. Is at Fort Mose because he escaped from a plantation in South Carolina. And I think I'm going to take it a little bit further, and I'm going to include, if he's escaping from a plantation, we can make an inference that he was a slave, right? So I think I'm going to put Lucius and his family were also at Fort Mose to escape slavery. So although that wasn't in the text directly, I made that inference because I knew he was a slave if he worked on a plantation, and I know that in the text it said he went to look for refuge. So I went ahead and I made that inference that he went there to escape slavery. So let's see. Don't mind my cat, he's crying in the background, but let's take a look at what you're going to do this week. To practice rereading, you're going to head to Google Classroom and you're going to complete the assignment that's labeled Unit 6, Week 2, Reread. Now let's take a look at that assignment really quickly so you can see what you're doing. All right guys, here's what you're doing. It looks just like this. Head over to Google Classroom to reread this text and answer this question. You'll type your answer over here. I will talk to you guys tomorrow.